It's coming from classes and things of that nature. So welcome. My name is Dr. Reynaldo Rojas. I am the interim director of the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Center for this semester, while our regular director, Dr. Mahoney, is taking a sabbatical for this semester. And if our series of speakers, we have today with us Rosa Emilia Cordero. She's a PhD candidate from Rutgers University. And one of the reasons we want to bring in different speakers with different, intellectual curiosities, different areas of research. And Rosa Emilia's interest is on the intersection of slavery and gender and in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean, particularly in the areas in the northern part of the island, Arecibo, Aguadilla. That's what she is currently working on her dissertation. Hopefully she'll soon be done. So she's going to give us a preview of her research up to this point and some of her findings and what she's found. She's also done great work at Rutgers, but I want to just give her the floor so she can talk a little bit more about herself and her work, and then share for you her research up to this point. Thank you. And let me know that. Thank you.
Sophia Creole, single, field laborer, 60 years old, tall, black color, gray afro hair, black eyes, flat nose, large mouth, and registered in the Arecibo registry under number 2297. Sophia is one of 6 enslaved women and girls that lived and labored in Manatí, Puerto Rico, in Don Sarco Carab's smaller Hacienda Monserrate. Reduced to mere numbers, bodily characteristics, and a name devoid of kin, this is the only information the Slavery Registry of Arecibo cared to include about Sophia in its January 5, 1869 report. Its water-damaged existence exemplifies the harrowing fragments, distorted clues, and violent archival silences encountered by slavery scholars when exploring the intimacies of enslaved women and girls. It is a frustration that runs through my intellectual autobiography as I continue to engage in research projects that struggle to uncover the lives of marginalized women and girls and explore their critical roles in historical processes. So for those who don't know me, and I got a little bit of an introduction, and I believe the majority of you haven't gotten to know me until this moment, I'm truly so grateful to all organizers of this event for allowing me to be in community with y'all. I am a historian of the 19th century Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the African diaspora. I focus on Puerto Rico and issues of labor, particularly enslaved labor on the northwest of the archipelago. Particularly, I focus on gender, particularly the experiences of enslaved women and girls during Puerto Rico's period of emancipation. And abolition, notably how legal constructions of freedom and emancipation shaped and transformed enslaved women and girls' everyday lives and their political and legal realities and participation. More specifically, my current project examines Black women and girls, slavery, emancipation, and abolition during Puerto Rico's 19th century period of second slavery, with a regional focus on the northwestern Puerto Rican districts of Aguadilla and Arecibo. These are 2 incredibly important, yet overlooked regions that were mostly defined by domestic, small landholding and coffee slavery, and whose Black histories and histories of enslavement were silenced by grander narratives of sugar economies and imperial conflict. As some of you have probably encountered, Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean are oftentimes excluded from larger discussions about slavery in the Atlantic world, with Black Latin Americans and Spanish Caribbean people often encountering a rhetoric that either argues that slavery in the Spanish Atlantic was not that important or not that bad, or that even denies the significant existence of Black, Spanish, Caribbean, and Latin American people. In Puerto Rico's case, despite its contributions to the violent systems that fostered the Black Atlantic's growth, Puerto Rico continues to be viewed as exceptional to the Caribbean and the greater Black Atlantic, oftentimes because of its status as Cuba's smaller and less lucrative sister colony. This exclusion is further fueled by Puerto Rican academics who have promoted the post-slavery mythical figure of a white male jíbaro, or or rural worker as the essence of Puerto Ricanhood. Various works on slavery and Black history in Puerto Rico already resist that erasure. However, few do so through the exploration of enslaved women and girls, or with a perspective exclusively centered on Arecibo and Aguadilla. However, despite attempts to erase Blackness and consequently all evidence and responsibility for Puerto Rican white supremacy, there are certain historical phenomena that make Puerto Rico's participation in slavery, and specifically 19th century slavery systems, difficult to ignore. So to highlight this, I believe that it is important to emphasize 6 moments of profound social rupture, which are the moments that frame Puerto Rico's history during this period and this region of study. Number 1 is the Latin American Wars of Independence, which resulted in Puerto Rico's status as one of 2 remaining Spanish colonies, the other one being Cuba. 2, the spread of anti-slavery rhetoric and abolitionist movements, which resulted in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Brazil's status as 3 remaining slaveholding spaces in the Atlantic. 3, the Spanish colonial government's passing of the Murat Law of 1870, which was a Puerto Rico of domestic enslavement, kept young and mostly Black girls and women working as domestics under white households decades into the 20th century. This not only evidences the existence of a very evident 20th century gendered afterlife of slavery, but it also challenges typical timelines applied when studying abolition and post-abolition, a practice that is critical when studying a space that clearly clung to the institution of slavery longer than other Atlantic spaces. The 20th century is known in Puerto Rico as a period of transition from Spanish imperialism to U.S. control. However, perhaps if we don't focus on analyzing the ruptures brought by the shift in sovereignty, we can find an emphasis that, highlights continuities found through the study of post-emancipation labor structures and how those extensions of slavery's control echo current Black Puerto Rican struggles with anti-Blackness and white supremacy. I explored these significant changes through the lens of enslaved Puerto Rican women and girls' experiences as they lived and labored, again, in the districts of Aguadilla and Arecibo. So to exemplify and contextualize these changes, we can look at a case involving a 14-year-old girl named Rosa. So on April 10, 1872, and we can change the thing so we can get an idea of the space we're moving through. So on April 10, 1872, an enslaved Puerto Rican 14-year-old girl named Rosa, no last name, the daughter of an enslaved woman named Maria, also no last name, was sold for 1,000 pesetas by Don Juan Manuel Iglesia to Doña Juana de Leon with the consent of Juana's husband. According to their agreement, Rosa was to be transferred from Morovis, a municipality of the North Central District of Arecibo. Up there we can kind of see the district.
So welcome.
To Aguada, a far northwestern municipality of the Aguadilla district, where she would transition into the role of a criada, or a female domestic slave. Aguadilla is in that corner, and then you can kind of see the different municipalities, try to kind of visualize how that movement happened. So 2 years before this, in 1870, the documentation states that Rosa resided in Toa Baja, a municipality in the Bayamón district, which is the one over there. So basically, from Bayamón to the Arecibo district, to then the Aguadilla district. And this is outside of the capital, San Juan, and in that moment she was under the ownership of Joaquin Chéveres. There's no mention of what work she did in Toa Baja. Regardless, Doña Juana made sure to file all the necessary paperwork needed for Rosa's transfer and to establish herself as the enslaved girl's new owner. Her constant reassertion that she was the one to purchase the teenager with the permission of her legitimate husband, of course, allows the documentation to capture how the Doña directly yet subtly reminded municipal bureaucrats that the girl was to be hers, not her husband's, which is important to point out how also women participated in these slaveholding practices. Eventually, the process of sale ended with Rosa becoming Juana's domestic slave, where she would labor in the northwestern coastal municipality of Aguada, Puerto Rico. Rosa's movement across northern Puerto Rico from Toa Baja to Morovis and finally Aguada reveal more than the obvious unfree mobilities that occurred between the northern districts of Bayamón, Arecibo, and Aguadilla. They also demonstrate the material and physical consequences experienced by enslaved women and girls of the region in the changing context of specific slaveholding practices. So if we can go actually back to the older one to kind of like give a face to what was happening, like give a material consequence to what was happening. In 1870, the year of Rosa's first recorded sale, Puerto Rico saw the Spanish government's formulation of a gradual emancipation law known as the Moret Law of 1870 that liberated all enslaved children born to enslaved women that year while bonding them to their mother's masters until the age of 22. Although that law did not apply to Rosa, her enslaver of the time, Joaquin Chévez from Toa Baja, surely feeling the very obvious threats to his ownership and capital through the looming possibility of full emancipation in the archipelago, likely sold the then 12-year-old to Don Juan Manuel from Morovis in an effort to strategically and grimly capitalize off of the enslaved child one last time. After him, Don Juan Manuel may have done the same, exploiting Rosa's field work for 2 years before eventually cutting his losses and handing her over to Doña Juana in 1872, just a year shy of the Spanish Cortes' passing of the final abolition law, promising to immediately free the men, women, and children who remained enslaved in Puerto Rico. With the passing of a law promising final abolition, one would think that Rosa's servitude would quickly come to an end, as Doña Juana's ownership would conclude in just a year. Instead, previously enslaved women and girls saw their servitude extended through the Liberto system, a 3-year period between 1873 and 1876, where enslaved laborers would be forced to sign gendered and grooming labor contracts with their former owners. This system of racialized post-emancipation labor would later transition into the criada system, which, again, echoing the language of domestic enslavement, would keep young black girls working under white households, where they would labor in exchange for room and board. And this consequently provided an afterlife to slavery into the 20th century. Doña Juana undoubtedly benefited from these systems, with her purchase potentially showcasing the nefarious racial mathematics that the white Puerto Rican woman engaged in, while making the decision to purchase the enslaved teenager for domestic labor during Puerto Rico's transition to abolition. She could have sensed that her mastership would be extended long after final abolition. Unlike her husband, who did not have to seek his spouse's permission when purchasing a human commodity, Juana asserted power through her purchase of a teenage enslaved domestic worker set to labor under her supervision within her white household. With her purchase accomplished during Puerto Rico's transitional period of abolition and within the white gendered roles of her hierarchical emancipation and abolition practice during Puerto Rico's 19th century period of second slavery, a moment in which the archipelago again became one of 2 remaining Spanish colonies and one of 3 remaining slaveholding spaces. Importantly, my scholarship explores enslaved women and girls' experiences while uncovering the realities of their enslavement in a region historiographically deemed unimportant because of its separation from the archipelago's few sugar slaveholding spaces. So using unexplored archival sources revealing the Northwest 19th century gender slaveholding patterns, I argue for a new understanding of Puerto Rican and Atlantic slavery that does not revolve around sugar or a quantitative approach that prioritizes higher numbers of slaves in production. By centering the lives of Black women and girls who lived through enslavement in a historically neglected region during the tumultuous time of emancipation and abolition, I want to provide an alternative narrative that places Black women and non-sugar slavery as central to Puerto Rico's history of 19th century slavery, emancipation, and abolition. The Arecibo and Aguadilla region might not have been dominant sugar producers, but a system of 19th century enslavement did exist in those districts. Aguadilla, for example, sometimes fleetingly appears in Puerto Rican slavery historiography as a space with a very high slave concentration. Not much details is given about that, but it's also presented as a space that had an 85-mile radius separation from Hispaniola, an island with a history of revolution and anti-slavery movements originating in Haiti. Like other Caribbean sites of slavery, the documentation shows that Black women and girls existed within this non-sugar region. In fact, according to an 1841 population census, and also despite archives being marked by the absence of Black Puerto Rican women and girls' voices, Black women actually constituted half of the liberto or freed population, or a little bit more than half of the freed population in Puerto Rico, and also a 48%, or just a little bit less than half of the population of the enslaved population. Consequently, as found by historian Marisa Fuentes when studying Barbados, the women and girls that appear in the archive offer a crucial glimpse into the lives lived under the domination of slavery. These are lives equal to those of people more visible in the archive and the historiography. And in knowing this and believing this, I attempt to tell their stories and center their experiences. Thus, my central argument is that the Northwest of Puerto Rico offers a distinct window into a gendered slaveholding world, one that produced its own systems of enslavements and meanings of freedom and family, and became a place where the enslaved women and girls living within it created their own, admittedly restrained, cultural and social worlds. But with these realities being framed by larger shifts concerning slavery and the construction of a post-slavery society. So, I don't know if we can go back to having Puerto Rico. So I think by now y'all have probably clocked that I have a little bit of beef with sugar, or that I'm constantly trying to pull away from sugar. So I want to take a moment to discuss why this is so important to me. And to start, in 2003, historian Joseph Dorsey published a book on 19th century slavery and race relations in Puerto Rico, and described the archipelago as rightly or wrongly identified as small, obscure, and therefore less important to the economic affairs of the Spanish crown. And I would argue that despite its contributions to the violent systems that helped create the Black Atlantic, Puerto Rico continues to be viewed as an exception to the Caribbean and the greater Black Atlantic because of its smaller sugar slaveholding economies. For example, historian Schmidt Novarra describes how Puerto Rico lagged far behind Cuba in the scale of its plantation complex, a statement that is it's undeniably true. Consequently overshadowed by the 19th century second slavery sugar plantations of the United States, Cuba, and Brazil, and impacted by the continuous underfunding of archival presentation tied to Puerto Rico's continued colonial status, slavery and its deep roots in the formation of Puerto Rican society have been understudied. Yet, just like in Cuba and Brazil, the institution of slavery persisted, although in a different scale, in Puerto Rico until relatively late, with abolition only arriving in 1873. So where does Puerto Rico, a Spanish territory that never fully transformed into a sugar slaveholding economy, fall into this story? So as beautifully summarized by another historian, Stuart B. Schwartz, in Tropical Babylons, great book, highly recommend. Scholars have become accustomed to associating sugar, slavery, and capitalism, perhaps rightfully so because of the massive violence and consumption of enslaved labor that sugar production produced. And according to Schwartz, the sugar plantations, large estates, and barbaric consumption of enslaved labor produced a historiographical thesis that viewed plantation regimes, slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, and capitalism as phenomena that inevitably or undoubtedly grew as a part of the same complex, causing the sugar plantation to become the framework through which the historiography on Atlantic slavery would tell the story of enslavement. Consequently, within this historiography of the Spanish Caribbean, slavery seemed to only matter most when sugar was at the center of the economy. For example, Cuba's slaveholding practices only seem to become significant within the historiography after its 19th century ascension into a sugar plantation slavery society. For Puerto Rico, the focus on sugar has resulted in a Puerto Rican slavery historiography that argues the archipelago's importance within 19th century slaveholding systems by focusing on the coastal sugar slaveholding southern region. Consequently, between the historiography's focus on Puerto Rico sugar plantations and white Puerto Rican elite representations of the white Jíbaro as the representative of Puerto Ricanness, there is scant literature on other slaveholding regions and economies, and as a result, a current denial of blackness in spaces like Aguadilla and Arecibo. So how does this, affect us today? The way that you can see this denial is like, for example, while I was on a summer archival trip to Puerto Rico in 2022, I had the pleasure of visiting several mountainous and marginalized coastal municipalities. And during my time there, I was able to engage with local nonprofit organizations, which were in their majority founded by Black Puerto Rican women, focused on the economic and social uplift of small, rural, and predominantly Afro-Puerto Rican farming and fishing communities severely affected by governmental neglect and ecological crises. During that trip, I visited the coastal community of Las Mareas, which is located in Salinas, Puerto Rico, and I received a tour of the mangroves and the salt mines in the area, and this tour was led by a Black Puerto Rican team. This person gave, and his name was Brandon, he gave a very impressive overview of the ecosystem's flora and fauna. And as he led us through the water, I kept thinking about how mangroves function as key places for runaway slaves. This was a phenomenon that was caused by the habitat's natural ability to conceal Black fugitives of slavery. He also spoke of the salt mines that existed within that space. But when asked about the demographics of the laborers, he simply said that they were very poor, without any specific mention of race and gender. When I spoke to him about my interest in studying Black women in slavery, my interest in studying Arecibo and Aguadilla, and why I wanted to focus on emancipation and abolition in the 19th century, because he asked me what were my interests and what had brought me there. His question to me was, what is emancipation? And this was a question that honestly shocked me a lot, considering how those historical processes affected and still affect the archipelago and the lives of Afro-Puerto Ricans in particular. And unfortunately, him as a Black Puerto Rican teenager existing within Puerto Rico has the burden of currently dealing with the consequences of slavery and its afterlives in Puerto Rico. So after that experiences, I also visited a coffee hacienda in Adjuntas where local white community organizers proudly spoke about their current anti-colonial food growing and cultivation practices without ever mentioning slavery or the 19th century violent labor practices that originally sustained that space. And it was honestly a little bit difficult to listen to them proudly talk about the coffee shop they had been able to open in the hacienda and marketing the space as a now 21st century space that symbolizes and represents, freedom and food autonomy without, kind of taking the space to acknowledge the dark but, very necessary to acknowledge past of slavery. And when I also did that tour, I was accompanied by several Black Puerto Rican academics and scholars, many of them whose families were from spaces such as Caguas, Utuado, or even Adjuntas, spaces where Blackness is actively denied because of what I just spoke to you guys about. And everybody really left with this really sad and bad taste in one's mouth, because it's another example of how we're literally standing in a coffee hacienda, a space that was a slaveholding space that was built through slavery, and nobody wanted to talk about that. So interactions like these evidence the silencing of Black Puerto Rican past and presence. They remind us of the urgency to create projects that center slavery and emancipation in the Spanish Empire through other understudied histories, like the histories of Black Puerto Rican women and girls in spaces like Arecibo and Aguadilla. Engaging with gender, regional, legal, and labor history, and covering the entire span of the 19th century, I hope to provide an analysis that works around those conversations around slavery in Puerto Rico. And ultimately, I want to place Puerto Rico and Black women and girls at the forefront to reframe our understanding of Atlantic slavery and African Black life in the Atlantic world by centering the archipelago, and specifically that area, as a space of enslavement and re-enslavement. So I also just want to say that when you create that space and when you have that focus, you make room for the thousands of untold stories and Black histories of the women and girls of regions like Aguadilla and Arecibo, whose lives were deeply framed by the archipelago stories of enslavement and the commodification of Black people's lives and even afterlives. With that, I want to talk about Catalina's story. This is so you guys can kind of get an idea of what is the state of the documents, and it's just not like, there's multiple erasures happening. It's not only the colonial voices that are peeking through the colonial workers that were taking these notes and very much letting their biases like flow through them. There's also a process of preservation that is very precarious, and you're dealing with documents that are faded, and it's just another like material example of how these histories are slipping away from us, and why there's this urgency to talk about them. So here we can see the case of Catalina Crece. And on April of 1847, a freed morena of the Puerto Rican coastal barrio of Playuela, Aguadilla, named Catalina Crece quietly passed of old age, leaving behind no testament or obvious family to inherit her modest fortune of 130 pesos, 1 real, and 7 moros. By March 16 of 1847, the courts made the hasty decision of allowing Catalina's possessions to be transferred and subsequently absorbed by her white next-door neighbor, Antonio Hidalgo's fortune. A decision no doubt solidified by the strong legal presence of his lawyers and Catalina's lack of legally recognized family. And it is important to point out that the auditors in charge of monetizing what remained of the Black woman's life admitted that they found her hijo de crianza, or child by upbringing, son by upbringing, Anastasio Alvarez, still residing in the property, but insisted that Catalina was kinless. This decision ended up being temporary and the start of what eventually developed into a lengthy legal battle involving multiple people who believed themselves entitled to what survived the deceased freed Black woman. Soon enough, more possible heirs would appear in Aguadilla's civil court system to justify their claims to what little physical evidence remained of Catalina's life's work and existence within the Playuela's community. However, Antonio, Catalina's only mentioned, yet non-biological son, did not participate in the proceedings, nor in the production of Catalina's archive. Instead, what remains of others' legal interactions, as manifested in individuals' testimonies, are the lies told about the deceased morena and the different negative versions of Catalina that were strategically constructed for the benefit of one self-proclaimed heir over the other. The appraisal and market values appointed to Catalina's earthly possessions and the resulting interpretations of Catalina's personal, familial, economic, and communal worth provide new meanings and use to what historian Dana Rami Berry groundbreakingly identified as ghost value. In Berry's analysis, ghost value is defined as the price tag affixed to the deceased enslaved bodies in post-mortem legal constatations or as they circulated through the domestic cadaver trade. In Catalina's case, with the analytical use of her intestado or intestate, which means the lack of testament, we can witness how her ghost value is operating not through the purchase and transfer of her body, but through the worth appointed to what was left of her life after death. And this is just an example of how like racial capitalism and slavery's capitalism has a deeply material impact over people, because she's being valued even after being freed and then even after dying. And there's a whole legal debate involving a lot of white Puerto Ricans over the value of her stuff and who gets to get her stuff. So with this document, I wish to discuss her 1847 intestado to analyze what the available sources may reveal or primarily obscure about the previously enslaved Puerto Rican woman's experiences as she lived and labored in Aguadilla. I wish to discuss also the writing possibilities that are born out of the violent and anti-Black colonial documentation, and then the process attempt to understand Playuela society, including how multiple competing systems of oppression manifest themselves within this space, Catalina's relationships, and individuals' testimonies. Through the document, we witness how the testimonies of various
friends, family members, and acquaintances negatively shape what we know about Catalina and how she moved through her world. Yet all these individuals, while all exercising dominance and privilege over Catalina's memory, presented her and maneuvered Aguadilla Spanish colonial legal structure differently. These distinctions were informed by what was available to them because of their social standing and the complexities or openings that those societal understandings presented. Unfortunately, we're gonna witness how Catarina's archival presence continues to be marked by a mutilated historicity. In the end, this is not a case involving the testament and last wishes of a previously enslaved woman's will. Instead, it is one centered on the absence of the freed woman's will, both in bequest and desire. Through these testimonies, we witness how the will of others distorted what we can now access about Catalina. Amongst those who misrepresented her are an enslaved man named Francisco Frese. So in going back to the case, although the officials handling her case handed over what remained of Catalina's life in Playuela to her white next door neighbor under the assumption that Catalina was kinless, Francisco Frese, an enslaved horsekeeper, revealed himself as Catalina's ahijado, or godson, and provided an inventory of the many ways he economically and emotionally assisted his madrina. Moreover, to solidify his statement, Francisco solicited the support of his enslaver, Don Pedro de la Rosa, who legitimated Francisco's testimony by contextualizing the depths of their emotional, familial, and economic connections. According to the enslaver, who was in representation of his slave, he confirmed that Francisco was the ahijado of Catalina and said professing love to her as if she were his mother, and thus the true owner of the freed Morena's possessions. According to the enslaver, everything Francisco acquired had been handed over to Catalina so she could live through Francisco's sales and field work and eventually administer his earnings to accumulate enough capital to give him freedom. Don Pedro, to further evidence his slaves' claims to kinship, money, and freedom, insisted that he saw in this procedure that his slave wanted to both get out of his condition and to help his godmother. So there's a whole historiography in Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean that points out how women were essential to finding freedom for their kin and their chosen kin. Either it be because they were literally birthing children that were supposed to legally be considered free through those free womb laws that we had discussed, but also because enslaved women sometimes had the tendency to involve themselves in other side economies or market economies that allowed them to gain enough capital to then purchase the freedom of their kin. And it seems that Francisco, as godson of Catalina, wanted to participate in that process. And Francisco, enslaver, emphasized that even though throughout the years he gave her money and, assisted her in which way so he could be free, she showed nothing. That was the words that he used. Thus portraying Catalina as someone indebted to Francisco and his slave owner by consequence, because let's be honest, that man was probably there because he was the one that was gonna reap the economic benefits of Francisco's sale for freedom. So for less than a month, Francisco's clever attempts at gaining his deceased madrina's capital seemed to be working, but unfortunately by May 19 of 1847, a new pair of creditors showed up and made their presence known, and they were armed with evidence perhaps a little more convincing than a slave owner's testimony. An 1841 judicial filing in which Catalina formally declared herself as indebted to them, and a receipt for Catalina's funeral services to prove that they'd upfronted the costs of the ceremony. So in the 1841 filing, which is the only document in which Catalina is explicitly involved, Catalina confesses in front of a scribe and 3 white male witnesses that the don and doña had given her 135 pesos to spend on the expansion of her estate, but no other clues are mentioned about the enslaved woman's relationship to this couple or why they paid for her funeral services. So because of that new filed evidence, what ended up happening is that the courts declared that they were both inheritors, so her stuff And what remained of Catalina's existence and everything she built within Playuela society was to be sold in public auction, and whatever, you know, money was acquired was to be divided by them. But in the end, only the white inheritor was like signed off as having received any money from that interaction, thus, you know, demonstrating the limitations of Francisco as an enslaved man. So here we can and then keep clicking. We can kind of see how the will of three men, all advantaged in different ways, because we're not going to position Francisco at the same level as like the white men that were operating within the situation. We can see how they like took advantage and shaped what we now might know about Catalina. According to Antonio Hidalgo, Catalina loved nobody and was loved by nobody. She had no kin, and that's why him as the neighbor, he had to inherit that money. According to Francisco Frese and his enslaver, it is implied that she was deeply loved by her ahijado, but she never seemed to fully share the same sense of familiar responsibility because she never completed her end of the bargain regarding Francisco's manumission. And finally, to Rovira and his wife, which were the last people that kind of showed up with the notarial record, Catalina was the black woman that owed them money even after her death. So can we get a sense of who Catalina was, despite what these men are saying? We will obviously never know her completely, but you know, perhaps by closely inspecting the documentation, including the mechanical and unemotional lists of her belongings, we can perhaps dismantle those one-dimensional narrations. But the truth is, can we truly? So here is where my work in really trying to like create these narratives that go beyond what these documents say goes. And it's like, for example, we can see the possessions created by the auditors, and in that list of possessions we can witness how her green beaded rosary with the gold cross likely danced a lot around her fingertips as she prayed every night. We can envision the golden hoops she would proudly dangle from her ears on every special occasion, and the gold ring she carefully and discreetly stored in her wooden chest. We can also picture the canvas bed sheets, or the strips of rags, as the auditors ungenerously called them, that she would dress her bed with every night, or the old pillow that with use had been perfectly molded to comfortably fit Catalina's head, and the hand-woven comforter that cloaked and warmed her body as she slept. We may visualize how Catalina might have traveled back to her fine bohío, or her wooden hut, cooked in her small kitchen using the 2 large clay pots, and shared a meal served on her 3 ordinary or everyday plates with the non-biological son she raised, named Anastasio, and her godson Francisco. Yet the limits of the archive continue to prevent us from truly knowing her desires, including what she wished and would have happened with her estate after her death. Instead, what we can do is read and think about the purpose her material items served, or what they might have meant for her. Regardless, what remains of Catalina demonstrates what happened at the intersection of non-plantation enslavement, manumission, kinship, gender, and limited legal and financial independence. Her archival traces also show the consequences of enslavement on Black women and girls' archives. As a freed woman who owned property, she created enough capital within Aguadilla society for individuals to fight about her death. Yet, while the Spanish Caribbean legal system made room for enslaved and freed individuals' testimonies and testaments, this case exemplifies the limitations of those premises. And as a result, Catalina's archive becomes a place where it is impossible to meet her in her own terms. Still, this document, like others, provide restricted insight into the Northwest Puerto Ricans, enslaved and ex-Black women's brutally unjust realities within the 19th century Spanish Puerto Rican Caribbean, while simultaneously providing glimpses into the cultural, economic, and social worlds they built themselves. As stated by historian Marisa Fuentes, through the voices of the enslaved are mitigated or silenced by colonial officiality, there is still much that can be said about the condition and context of enslavement and how the production of historical subjects affects or hampers narrative possibilities. Thank you.
So, questions or comments or inquiries or anything that, and we had a long conversation earlier at lunch, and I know some of the students, right, especially about the question of erasure and sort of the lack of black narrative sometimes in certain aspects of American history and culture, right? But if any of you want to ask the question, or any other of the folks that are joining us that were not in our earlier, more informal conversation, want to ask anything about Rosa Emilia's, research or her findings, or what you take out of it, or what does she take out of it, right? Where she goes next. Right? Maybe I asked that. What are your next plans? Where are you going?
I mean, God willing, I would like to graduate from my PhD and become a professor and researcher in an institution. That is the goal. Let's see how the job market treats me.
Yes. Hopefully we'll have a space for you, but hey, I'm just saying.
Ooh.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm curious, how did you choose this subject for your dissertation? You grew up in Puerto Rico?
Yes, I grew up in Puerto Rico, born and raised in Santurce. You know what that means?
Growing up in Puerto Rico, your experience, what it's like, what you call denial of the blackness.
Yeah.
We are wanting to talk about this subject, and people are not black, trigueños. So how you, as the young generation, compared to me, how did you choose this important subject to
Yeah.
research?
Thank you for that question. So there's like multiple things that led me to choose this subject, but then also choose history as the avenue through which I could explore these curiosities of mine. But the first thing is that I'm born and raised in Puerto Rico, lived in Puerto Rico until I was 23 and like accepted into a PhD program, and was like, okay, then we gotta go for like pursue bigger professional goals. And then on top of growing up in Puerto Rico, I did grow up in Santurce, which I'm very proud of, but like one of the interesting things about Santurce is that this is a space that I've learned through my historical research, that it was actually founded originally, and it was originally called San Mateo de Cangrejos in the late 1700s or mid 1700s, mid to late 1700s, by a community of freed people. So this kind of history has carried on and has kind of continually established Santurce to this day. Now there's like an issue with settler colonialism, Act 22, people from the US moving there. But Santurce has historically remained a space that is predominantly black and working class. And my own family histories intersect with that, although also the histories of silencing blackness in Puerto Rico also intersect with my histories, my own family histories. I grew up in a space where it was very much like mejoramiento de la raza. That's why I am a white Puerto Rican woman. Currently, even though like many of my family members are black Puerto Ricans. But so it was kind of like that dual understanding of like it's not, racelessness or this idea of la gran familia puertorriqueña, oh, we're all coffee with milk, we're all mixed, so we shouldn't talk about race, todo estamos mezclado, there's no racism here. Like that had very material consequences over my own family histories and over my own everyday realities within that space. But there was also the duality of growing up in a space that was predominantly black, and where I saw like black Puerto Ricans who were also very proudly black Puerto Rican and who very openly talked about their blackness, like moving around that space. So then when you intersect that with my journey into discovering history as a discipline, because unless you might have like parents who are professors or like something in your life that really showed you that being a historian was a possibility, it wasn't a thing that I knew could be a thing. Like I think we all grow up knowing what a doctor does, like what a medical doctor does, what an engineer does, but we don't really understand that we can pursue something such as like being a historian. So once I understood that and then started delving into the historiographies of Puerto Rican history, that denial of blackness, that like overemphasis on the jíbaro and la gran familia puertorriqueña, and then started delving into the projects that spoke about slavery and blackness, but then only did so through this very like contained framework, that kind of like transformed into me first being like in my classes like y Puerto Rico, Like, why aren't we talking about Puerto Rico? What do you mean? Like, reading things like, oh, Puerto Rico did not benefit from these black networks of exchange. Puerto Rico does not have black people or whatever. And me being like, are you crazy? Like, just go to Puerto Rico, move around. Like, what do you mean? And then on top of that, then being like, oh, black people in Puerto Rico are only in Ponce, which was a sugar slave holding space, in Loíza, and in Santurce, because of that history from the early, the 1700s. It then turned into, no, like, there are black Puerto Ricans that are from other mountainous spaces, other coastal municipalities. Like, in my own family histories, we have, like, black Puerto Ricans from San Sebastián, from Ciales. Spaces where blackness, if blackness is denied in Puerto Rico, blackness is very much denied in those spaces. So it just all kind of transformed into, you know, my advisor sitting down with me and being like, I think you want to study slavery, and I think you want to contribute to these conversations and point out these silences through this type of work. And then it just so happened that I went to the archives in Puerto Rico, and they were like, oh, Arecibo has this beautiful, like, very well organized a collection, and that people don't tap into when they're trying to study these subjects, because they assume that there are no black people that will show up in those spaces, which is untrue. And, you know, after creating relationships with the archivist, it was like, okay, let's do it. Like, let's focus on this. The material is here. And you can see, like, I'm literally sifting through these notarial records of all of Aguadilla's district, and I'm like, you see these lists of coffee haciendas, of like women who are dying, white women who are dying and leaving these testaments and moving around their domestic slaves. And it's like, what do you mean there is no slavery there? And then you mix that with the current situation where there are black people in those spaces that move to those spaces and get told things like by white Puerto Ricans, like, no, where are you from? You can't be from here because you're like you're black. And, you know, them having that impact of like, but I'm born here, like, this is my town, it's in mi pueblo, and I'm generationally from here, so what do you mean? So all of those things kind of like resulted in me taking this journey.
I don't want to take over, but what would be the value of 100 pesos in dollars today? Because these men were fighting for 110 pesos. I wonder how much that would be now.
So I've tried doing the conversions, and then I've been told not to do that because it's like not that accurate. But I believe that it was significant, but not that significant. But I think it was more a contestation of the land. Like they want, because Playuela, that's a coastal area, that's a very like fertile area. Even today there are fights over Playuela. Like there are movements over Playuela del Pueblo, because in Puerto Rico there's this whole movement to like slowly privatize and sneakily like privatize the beaches and coasts in Puerto Rico. And Playuela has been like one of those spaces. Like if you listen to PJ Sinsuela, who's a black Puerto Rican rapper, he's like, que yo cante, que no se vende Playuela. Like this is a space that continues to be fought over and continues to be valued by white Puerto Ricans in a way that's and white U.S. people now currently with the colonial status in a way that's completely different from like the black Puerto Ricans that are generationally from that space. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other inquiries or none? No, nobody has to have another. Yes, Brenda.
I find that a lot of times when we look at Puerto Rican history, it usually starts, not usually, but often, there's so much more resources. Once the island was enslaved by the Spaniards, but our history prior to that, our history is very connected to our Spanish slave masters versus who was there before and the mixtures of the African slaves that came. Where would you go to find, you know, our history prior to slavery?
Yeah. So doing pre-colonial or indigenous history in Puerto Rico is very difficult. And perhaps I'm not like the best source for doing that because I do focus on 19th century slavery and the 19th century period, and I focus on like black enslavement specifically. But the one moment that I had where I was like, okay, like perhaps this could be a source where you could talk about pre-colonial histories was in the Archivo de la Colección Nacional, or the archive of the National Collection of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture and Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña. And this is an archive that collects and preserves objects, not documents. So there's a lot of musical instruments, figures of deities that are preserved there, figures made out of like seashells, instruments made out of shells, como un cariño. And although I'm not the best person to like contextualize the meaning behind these artifacts, I know that they're there. And actually that was a recent discovery for me, because another thing about living in a colonial reality and, you know, people not really communicating about their histories or like, you know, emphasizing history, actually there's now the president of the system of the University of Puerto Rico, which has 11 campuses, has now filed a motion to try to close down all history departments in all the UPR system. Yes. Crazy mod, but
Wow.
because of situations like that, it's hard to find the resources to do that type of work. And me, myself, a person who has been doing archival research in Puerto Rico since 2019, like I did not know that archive existed until 2022. And it was then that I kind of tried to like, you know, make friends with archivists there. There's actually a wonderful like Black Puerto Rican archivist there named Laura Quiñones. And that's how I was able to gain that access. And now one of my missions is to try to publish a digital guide of that archive so people know that those are sources that they can tap into, and that perhaps those are the types of histories that can be done.
Any other questions, reactions, comments?
Are there remnants of the indigenous people still in Puerto Rico?
What do you mean, remnants?
Like descendants that will identify themselves as the indigenous?
Yeah, so that's another difficult conversation because one of the discourses that was promoted almost from the beginning of Spanish colonialism was that the Taino, which is taught to us as the indigenous community in the archipelago, died or became extinct. That's one of the conversations that happened. And even me growing up in Puerto Rico, the conversation was like, there are no Tainos or indigenous people in Puerto Rico. However, there are certain people that do identify as Taino and emphasize that as their, you know, racial and cultural background. And again, unfortunately, I'm not the best person to speak about that subject, but it is a conversation that is beginning to happen in Puerto Rico because, again, going back to archival silences and like these wider imperial colonial discourses, like we were literally taught that there are no indigenous people and that they like immediately ceased to exist in the beginning processes of colonization in Puerto Rico. So it's also a struggle for those peoples to claim indigeneity because, yeah, it's seen as impossible. And again, I'm not the best person to confirm or deny anything. I'm unfortunately not a part of those conversations, but I have to expand my knowledge bases. But yeah, thank you for the question.
All right. We had here the 4 o'clock, right? We had and nobody's gonna kick us out of the room, but we have book 3 through 4. So again, you can stay and talk to Rosa Emilia if you have, more informally, if you have any other comments or questions. But thank you all for coming. Thank you all for attending. We're very thankful, and I know Rosa Emilia is too. There's a very good audience for this, and we have a poet, coming out next week with Ayuan Noel, and then we're gonna have posters for other 2 historians and researchers that are coming in the last week of classes, Aurora Santiago and Yorel Melendez Vadillo, who are gonna have their own separate presentations, and they're gonna have a panel. They published a chapter on Bad Bunny and his kind of influence and what's going on, and kind of exploring what's going on and the enigma of Bad Bunny. And so they're gonna have a panel on the Bad Bunny phenomena and what does it mean from their point of view and what's happening. So we're gonna have posters of that. So they're gonna be on a Wednesday, and then their individual talks are gonna be on a Thursday. That's 7 and 8, of May. That's gonna be our final closure of our semester. But stay put. We're gonna keep sending announcements, and we're gonna put posters. And again, with Ayoan Noel is gonna have something at the New York Public Library on Wednesday, and then on Thursday he's gonna have one of these. Recite some poems and talk about his work. So again, thank you all for supporting the center. Thank you all for supporting Rosa Emilia's work, and I hope she keeps us posted to what's going on, where she ends up. So we're very excited. Thank you again for coming, because she was in Puerto Rico and she flew all the way to this cold.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Thank you.
She's doing her field work and research, and we thought she was in Rutgers. She is, but not physically. And it's like, oh, can you come over to this cold? And she's like, yes, I can. Yeah. So thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing your work with us, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.